So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
Persistence of vision.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Persistence of Vision podcast, the podcast that makes you wonder why. Wonder why, how, and indeed how and why.
I like that. Wonder why. Why so much, maybe?
Why so much, for example? Why
right.
so much?
Why do I bring up why so much? Why do I say that? Why do I repeat that every podcast? It's because it's the title of my book. And if you go to our website, which is pov-publishing.com, you can see links to my book, Why So Much, by Lance Myers. You can see a link to LB's book, The Goddamn Fool. What else?
You can see a ton of stuff there. Those are the most important things by far.
That's right.
But
There's where you can spend money.
There's a lot of great writing. There's a lot of great cartoons. And, of course, there's the entire archive of these wonderful podcasts where we talk about books and where we inspire conversation.
And today we have a conversation with Robert Ferris. Hooray!
Hey!
Hi, Robert.
It's so good to be here.
And, okay, so when we asked you to do the podcast, what book did you choose?
I chose Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury.
Why didn't you tell us? We could have read it. I'm joking, of course. Tell us, Robert, why this book?
It stands out in my early years of reading. I remember in 8th grade reading this at the same time of several of my friends. And I was one of those kids who was a reader, so I'd read a lot at that point. Mm-hmm. But this book had me so engaged, so captivated, that I raced through it to a degree that I couldn't remember. And I also, because I had friends reading it, we would call each other up and go, "Oh my God, have you gotten to this part?
Oh, that's
my
great.
God." And we would share this stuff.
What age is this?
13, which
13,
figures in because that's the age of the two
right.
protagonists.
Yes.
So I think because Bradbury paints such a vivid picture of being at that hinge point of childhood and adulthood, and there's so much longing on the kid's part to be older, that I felt like that captured where I was to a degree that I don't think, most of the books I had read, adventure books, science fiction books, fantasy books, they all had adult protagonists. And I read a lot of comic books, so I read, Batman and Robin and things like that, but I tended to feel more like they were the adults' stories rather than the kids' stories. And this, I don't know, it just stood out. And Bradbury's writing, to me, is like nobody else's. I mean, It was, at that point in my life, I hadn't read anybody like him. And after a while, as I became more of a writer, and I wondered where my style had come from, what had influenced me, I think Bradbury may have been the first really influential figure as a writer that gave me the freedom to write in a certain way. I won't say I'm anywhere in his league, but he has
you
such.
Won't say you're not.
Well, he has such an extravagant quality to his writing. He's so vivid, and so he doesn't worry about that Hemingway-esque brevity.
No.
He'll take an idea and he'll embroider it until sometimes you're begging him to stop. But I think it serves this book so well. And so I felt like it was a really, there was just sort of I won't say it's the only book I've had this experience with, but it was definitely a book where there was sort of a before in my life and an after in my life.
Wow.
Well, that being said about his style, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a very dense, difficult style, though.
No.
Right.
And boy,
No,
does he know how to
conversational
plot.
in a way.
Yeah.
Folks.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
And the fact that he has written so often about small towns, as he does in this book, I think he's very relatable.
Right.
And he makes sure that whatever is going on with his protagonists, it's something that you can relate to.
Well, speaking of protagonists, we've said your name, Robert Ferris, and you've mentioned that you're a writer, but who are you? Who are you, Robert Ferris?
I'm a man of mystery.
Yeah.
I have the power to cloud men's minds. I am the arts editor for the Austin Chronicle. I started writing theater reviews for the Chronicle way back in the 80s when the paper was still very young. I kept with it because I enjoyed it, and then about 25 years ago, Nick and Lewis, who started the paper, gave me the opportunity to be the arts editor, and I've been at the Chronicle ever since.
Fantastic. And this book, we've been talking about it. What's it about?
So it is set in a small town. I don't know that the date is ever specified, but it's certainly 1920s-ish. So there's a bit of a nostalgic quality to it. I want to say that Bradbury might have been writing about his own childhood, but in a small Midwestern town, and they're two boys, best friends, and they do everything together. They're 13 years old. They have those sort of 13-year-old boy adventures. And then one night, this mysterious carnival shows up in town. It's very mysterious, and the boys immediately sense there's something strange and not right about it. And so they begin sort of their secret Encyclopedia Brown type investigation of what's going on here. And they see dark magic. I mean, really dark magic that plays on the desires of people in the town. And they see things that are horrible. That people in the town are transformed in horrible ways. And then they begin to want to warn people. And then they also worry that the carnival has figured out who they are and what they're doing and want to stop them.
Yes. And they're faced that dilemma that children who know about something bad going on face, where they are very concerned about whether anyone's going to take them seriously.
Right.
Yeah, so Stranger Things, right?
Yeah,
what else? I mean, since this, there has been a lot of this sort of thing, where it's like the children of the protagonist, they're in on something. It, for example.
Yeah.
Stephen King. So I was trying to think, what came before this that would have been in that vein? Is this one of the beginnings of this?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I hadn't really thought about that.
What comes to mind for me is Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
Sure.
Not the horror aspect, of course, but the extremely independent and imaginative boys who seem to do a lot of stuff that most of us when we were kids didn't manage to pull off.
Right.
Like running away from home and going across the country.
Yeah.
But yeah, that supernatural element, though, of being and I think, like you mentioned, it hooked you because it's that it gives the child the sort of special position of being in the know. Yes. Being the one I know something that no one else does. I'm faced with the challenge of taking it on myself because I'm the only one, right? That kind of thing. But it gives you the sense of responsibility if you're growing up. I feel like I'm the hero, right?
Right.
So were you the Jim or the Will of the?
I think I was very much the Will, who is the. I've always identified with the sort of stalwart, straight arrow characters. That's been more my life than anything else. And the thing about Jim, and man, does Bradbury hit the nose with these names? Jim Nightshade,
right? Yes.
And the evil carnival owner is Mr. Dark. It's I'm not going to leave any room for doubt.
Yeah.
But Jim is the one who feels more tempted to the dark side.
Yes.
And that just, I don't know. I've never felt like I have the courage or roguishness or whatever it takes. I was always Tom, not Huck.
Okay.
I identified with Luke, not Han. It's just, whenever there's that dichotomy of the heroes, I always go with, I go with Superman over Batman.
I see.
Those sorts of things.
Sure.
So I was very much Will and desperately wanting to do the right thing, desperately wanting to save his friend who he sees getting tempted to do the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. And the wrong thing in this case, or just the temptation, I guess I should say, is, like you said, this really also taps into the idea of the children on the verge of becoming adults and really wanting that transformation.
Right.
There's a lot of themes of innocence or coming of age or whatever it is, and Jim really wants that, right? He wants to be older.
Yeah.
And
there is a way in the carnival that can happen.
Right. Yeah. So I forget where I was going with that, but let's touch on the themes. So the themes are temptation to
desire and the
It,
danger of giving in to one's desire is a big thing.
Well, certainly it's not an accident that the title of the book, Something Wicked This Way comes from the witches in Macbeth.
Right.
Yeah.
Who, of course, provide Macbeth the inspiration for his fiendish activities for the rest of the play.
Right.
And who do so simply by telling him the truth, interestingly.
Yeah. And, one wonders if those witches hadn't been there, how willing Macbeth would have been to go down that road.
Yeah.
But, and would, similarly with if the carnival had never come to that town, would Jim have been tempted to do something in quite the same way? Mm-hmm. Other themes. It's, I sense a lot of regret in the book. There's a degree to which people who have given in to the carnival are expressing regret. But I always, especially on rereading it, I find the character of Will's father, who is the only real adult who has an active role in the story. He's a father who is older than average, and even though he's not what I consider that old now that I'm, through middle age, he's so worried about it. Mm-hmm. He feels like he can't be a real dad to his son because he's older than all of the other dads would be, and he hasn't really done anything with his life. He's a custodian for the town library, and he ends up being part of the key to sending the carnival away, or maybe the key. But his regret at the way he's lived with life really informs the novel, probably to a degree I didn't really recognize as a 13-year-old myself.
Yeah. Sure. Certainly time has got to be a theme to the novel. It's not only Jim who is dissatisfied with his age, being 13 years old.
Right.
There's a lot of people in the book who are unhappy with their ages, among other things.
Yeah.
And it also ties into a sense of community, I think, too, or identifying with other people your age or that sort of thing. Because isn't there a thing about how if you artificially age, you're sort of out of touch with the rest of, so if you're 13 and you age, through this magic to be in your 40s,
right,
you're still going to be a 13-year-old in a 40s sort of context.
Right. But then there's also that thing of being older than everyone around. If you stay in that community as a 40-year-old, you are suddenly so much older than your peers. And who is going to be able to relate to you?
Right.
How would Will relate to Jim still being 13 if Jim is 40?
Right.
So that's a combination of how do time time factor into community, and how does community respond?
Absolutely.
Definitely. And the community. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, I was going to move on to a different topic, actually. The idea of, okay, so a lot of these books, when we discuss them, I always sort of try to look for the context of, like, when it was written. Okay, so this is, what, 62, right?
Yeah,
the book
62.
was 60. Okay. So is there anything about these themes that we've been discussing that reflects, like, the sort of culture that he was writing in at the time? Were there any political... is there a political stage for this?
Sure.
Or a cultural stage for this that might have influenced, okay, I'm going to write a book about these particular things
Yeah.
that you can think of?
I think in part of it would have been Bradbury being of an age to have seen what the small town was, what the kind of community that informed an American small town pass away to an extent, and a lot of what we never talked about in small towns earlier in the 20th century were suddenly being ripped open and exposed through another book of the 60s, Peyton Place, which is,
Sure.
a big soap opera. But we're also seeing the civil rights movement where, are there any black people in this small town?
Yeah.
Not that we know of.
Right.
And yet the civil rights movement is saying we're not going to go unseen anymore, and we're not going to be invisible, and what's more, we are going to stand up for what is rightfully ours. So I think there is a lot, just in terms of community.
Right, sure.
There's a lot of that there. I mean, the comparison, if Peyton Place is about anything, it's about desire. And so I think there's also a lot of sense of what are these small town lives, and are there darker things that have always inhabited these small towns that, again, weren't talked about in the previous literature and, of course, Hollywood and television. So I think it's kind of stepping on and moving into the times in that way.
Right.
Although I have no idea if Bradbury was consciously responding to that or
Of course,
not.
yeah.
Well,
And he would have been, I keep stepping on, I was going to say, I mean, how old was he when he wrote this? Do you know what?
I think he was...
It's been in his 40s, right?
Yeah, I think he was in his late 30s, early 40s.
Okay.
I was just going to say that there were so many respects in which this early 60s, late 50s, early 60s period was a time of innocence lost.
Yeah, exactly.
And the sense, as you were saying, that the innocence maybe never had been there.
Right.
So many books like Babbitt and the what is it? The concept of the organizational man. A lot of critiques. Obviously, the increasing popularity of Freudian psychology, the idea of things being buried under the surface that are more sinister than what we pretend them to be, and of course the nuclear age.
Yes.
World War II having come back, and you, as you were saying, the disappearance of the small town as a primary social unit in the country as the country became increasingly urbanized and suburbanized. So we see a lot of that sense that there's something sinister, something wicked coming.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, fantastic. So you said that, you mentioned some of his other works. Are you a Bradbury fan through and through? Do you like all of his work?
Yeah, that was the interesting thing. I still vividly remember the junior high library, spending a lot of time in there. And I think the first book I read was, so many of them were short story collections. So the first book I remember checking out was R is for Rocket. And it opens with one of Bradbury's most famous short stories, A Sound of Thunder, where the two guys go back in time to hunt dinosaurs, and they're warned, don't stray off this path. things could happen. And of course, one guy like puts one foot off the path and crushes a butterfly, and they come back to the present, and everything's changed, and it's a radically different society and world. So, that's a wonderfully captivating story for a seventh grader to read.
Sure.
And then I just started going through others of the collection. The Illustrated Man was actually required reading for our ninth grade English classes. But I want to say Something Wicked was either the second or third book of his I read. I didn't go to necessarily the more famous ones like Fahrenheit 451 or The Martian Chronicles. This was one of the ones that I picked instead. And like I said, it was like suddenly gunning my reading ability to 120 miles an hour. And I want to point one other anecdote I'll throw in was I thought about who my friends were back during that period, and I couldn't recall who else might have been reading it at the time, see if this was just some phantom memory that I was confusing with something else that happened. So I have one friend from that period on Facebook, and he lives in Seattle, so we don't communicate very often. But I wrote him, and he didn't remember the same instances, but he did remember reading it about the same time. Wow. And in ninth grade, he had to do, or maybe it was eighth grade, he had to do some sort of English paper, and he chose that to do a paper on, and got some kind of flack from his teacher.
Really?
But he basically closed by saying, I remember that book being very influential on me too.
Oh, that's great.
So I just love that after this gulf of time, where now we're both older than Will's dad, that suddenly we can still recall something that vividly from our early teens.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So are there other writers? I mean, would you call him, like, so Ray Bradbury, what kind of genre? Like, what would you say, sci-fi?
I always considered him more of a fantasy novelist, just because he doesn't lean into the science very much. And in fact, there are whole stories and books that don't deal with any science at all. Yeah. They're more likely to be Twilight Zone. We're not going to bother to explain this.
I was going to mention Twilight Zone, sure, yeah.
Yeah, so, that's the book.
Although Fahrenheit
in.
451 is in some ways is kind of a classic sci-fi book, right? I mean, it's not that it's about science, but it's about a technological type of shift that changes the world. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's more political.
I've always thought of it as sci-fi, but I might be wrong. I've never actually read Fahrenheit 451.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think to greater and lesser degrees he leans into science some, but it's never to the degree that, say, Isaac Asimov does. Sure. And, if you start trying to look for something lyrical in Asimov's character, good luck. And even more than that, I think he's a humanist, I guess. Mm-hmm. He's just somebody who is more interested in human behavior, and whatever is going on in his books. I mean, the short stories often have that kind of O. Henry twist. Mm-hmm. But more often than not, as in this book, I think he's as interested in why humans do what they do and how they respond to certain stimuli than he is in just concocting a great plot, which he knows how to do and does extremely well. But if you take all of the character stuff out of this book, I don't think it would be a novel. I think, he might be able to get, just the plot of it, you could get a good short story out of, but I think it's more It's there because he really has great characters and great things to explore about them.
Yeah. Well, would you do us the honor of reading to us a little bit from it?
Oh, sure. There is, I was trying to think of one, there's one section. Oh, while I'm looking for it, I'll tell you one other thing about the difference in reading it at my age now and reading it when I was in 7th grade. And that is, I talked about racing through it at 120 miles per hour. Well, now because I have so much more of an appreciation of Bradbury as a prose stylist, and I found myself starting to get into that. Oh yeah, I forgot about this. Oh, what happens next? And then I realized I'm ruining some of the enjoyment I was starting to get from his writing style.
Yeah.
And I started slowing myself down to literally mouth the text out loud. And it was, as LB says, poetry. Mm-hmm. And like poetry, you don't want to race through a poem. You want to, each word is important.
Really savor.
And you want to savor the language.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a huge Steinbeck fan, and I've read that Bradbury was too, and I can definitely see the influence there. And I feel the same way, where a lot of times, like you mentioned, the folksiness of the tales that he's telling and the characters he's exploring are all very quaint and very engaging and very friendly and likable. But then you'll come across the turn of a phrase that just really gets you.
Okay, so Will and Jim meet this figure called the witch. There are so many strange figures in this carnival. There's a dwarf that they realize used to be somebody that they met, a lightning rod salesman who, for whatever desire he had, was crushed into a dwarf. There is a figure that enters the town encased in like ice, called the most beautiful woman in the world. There's Mr. Electrico. There are just all these wonderful, strange characters. But there is this witch. And she's really one of the more bizarre and frightening characters. And eventually, at one point, Will has a showdown with her on the roof of a house. But this is one of the early appearances. For the witch, though peculiar wax, was peculiarly alive. Blind, yes, but she thrust down rust-splotched fingers, which petted, stroked the sluices of air, which cut and splayed the wind, peeled layers of space, blinded stars, which hovered and danced, then fixed and pointed, as did her nose. And the boys knew even more. They knew that she was blind, but special blind. She could dip down her hands to feel the bumps of the world, touch house roofs, probe attic bins, reap dust, examine drafts that blew through halls and souls that blew through people, drafts vented from bellows to thump through people, drafts from wrists to pound temples to pulse throat and back to bellows again. Just as they felt that balloon sift down like an autumn rain, so she could feel their souls re-inhabit their tremulous nostrils. Each soul a vast warm fingerprint, felt different. She could roll it in her hand like clay, smelt different. Will could hear her snuffing his life away, tasted different. She savored them with her raw gummed mouth, her puff at her tongue, sounded different. She stuffed their souls in one ear, tissued them out the other. her hands played down the air. One for Will, one for Jim.
Nice.
So strong.
And she's in a hot air balloon
Yeah.
that floats over the town. And it's, that shadow of that balloon passes over you and you have stepped into an ice box.
So crazy.
Marvelous.
And look, they're like, is that the balloon that they pop with a bow and arrow, right?
Yes.
And then they have like dream of like burying it in some weird coffin or something.
Yeah,
So
that's
weird stuff.
and that is where Jim is already worried about Will, and Jim ends up going out after her alone, and he is on the roof of this house when he feels the balloon, sees it coming down, and she's after him, and she knows he's after him, and he has this little bow and arrow, which ultimately he shoots at the balloon and pops it. And it's the first sense that, we have some way to stand against these massively evil characters.
Well, it reminded me, the whole book reminded me, but it's this passage, obviously, of The Balloon Man, that poem. I think it's E.E. Cummings.
Yes.
Which I also read around the same time that you're talking about, 8th grade. And that's a very creepy, satanic kind of balloon man in that story also, that poem. But, marvelous reading. Excellent.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, do
Well?
you hear anything?
The sky seems to be getting darker. I feel a chill, like I'm in an icebox.
Distant rumbling.
Distant rumbling, and that can only mean the approach of something wicked, the lightning round.
The lightning round it is. Let me pull up my notes. I should know this by heart, but I just want to make sure. Okay, are you ready, Robert?
I am prepared.
I love it. All right, here we go. First question. Tell us about the first time you fell in love with a book.
That's one of the harder ones. Like I said, I was reading since I was very, very small. I think I really began to fall in love with books around the same period. It was in junior high. Like I said, I remember that library so vividly, and it was a time when I haunted the shelves and picked up so many books by authors that I hadn't read before that. Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days, was one. Bradbury's R's for Rocket is another. Melville's Moby Dick I read in that period. I don't know why or how. It's not required reading. Travels with Charlie by Steinbeck. A lot of discovery during that period. I wonder, here's an odd choice, a book that I haven't looked at in years, but I think I felt a lot of love, an unusual amount of love for the Phantom Toll Booth. Mm-hmm. It was just one of those crazy quest books that felt more relatable than Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but kind of had the same vibe.
Yeah.
It was a little Yellow Submarine-ish, and fun and funny, and the wordplay was something that mattered to me. So, let's go with Phantom Toll Booth.
Like it.
I love it. That's great. Okay. Has a book ever changed your mind?
This is a question I was trying to come up with a great answer for, and I don't know that I do. I've had many books blow my mind, and many books that open my mind. I don't know about changing my mind. Although, one of the more fascinating open my mind books may have been one I've read as an adult called God, a Biography, which won the Pulitzer Prize in the mid-'90s. And the whole idea was this was a literary critic rather than a theologian, or he walked both lines. And his idea was to look at the Old Testament as a literary document and to analyze the character of God the way we analyze famous characters in novels. And so he goes through all of the Old Testament and looks at it as a single narrative. And I just never read anything like that. And I loved it so much. He came out with a sequel called Christ, A Crisis in the Life of God, where he did the same thing with the New Testament. And I had the same experience, maybe even more profound. I reread that book last year. So, it made me, I've been a lifelong churchgoer. My family's Methodist, and I was in the church all my life, but that made me think about, what it means to be in the Christian church and to have that faith than I think anything else I've read. Fantastic.
Okay, well, here's the big brother to that question. Has a book ever changed your life?
In terms of being a writer and the kind of writer that I've been, one book I would put in that category is Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff. I read it when it came out. It was college, and I was beginning to realize I had more talent writing than I thought I did. And I was I took a couple of American Studies class with a guy named David Gaines, who has been teaching at Southwestern now for a long time. But at that time, he was in UT, and he was one of those great, you feel like he's almost not that much older than you are, and it's very free and open discussions. And the courses I took really looked at very contemporary books. And so he was interested in talking about Wolfe, and I wrote a couple of papers about his books, and I don't know if I read The Right Stuff before then, but it was the most vivid Wolfe I had read since then. And at one point in his class, I wrote a paper about Tom Wolfe in the style of Tom Wolfe. And The Right Stuff was, I think, maybe the book that convinced me I can be a writer, and here's a piece of here's a road I can go down in terms of how to write, a way of writing that feels right to me.
Don't you think Tom Wolfe he reminds me of R. Crumb, in that when I look at R. Crumb's cartoons, even though they're way better than anything I could do, they make me want to draw. He's like showing you his work, as it were. You can see the method, and you can picture yourself doing it with your own pen, and that's how I feel about Tom Wolfe. He makes you feel like you can write, even though he's blowing you away with how great he is, but at the same time, in a way that another writer might make you think, God, I wouldn't even bother trying to write. He makes you want to write.
That punk rock kind of...
Maybe that's right.
Yeah.
Very much.
Punk rock appeal. Well, that's a great answer. Thank you. Has a book ever made you cry?
I don't remember the exact experience of reading it. I would be very surprised if I did not cry reading Charlotte's Web as a kid the first time. You got to be made of stone not to cry then. But more vividly, I think there is an adult, it's not a whole book because it's just a collection of essays, but there is an essay that E.B. White wrote called The Ring of Time. And I've gone back to it multiple times. I had a friend who started hosting reading parties. I also met him through that same David Gaines American Studies class. But he would host reading parties where we all brought stuff and we went around the circle and read them out loud. It was great fun. And then at some point, my wife and I started hosting them. And I would always read this essay, and I could never get through it without tears.
Wow.
It's a beautiful thing. He describes walking around a circus, watching a circus rehearse, and he sees this young girl riding the horse and jumping on the back of a horse in the circle, and somehow circling around, and he sees an older woman training her. And something about making that circle makes him think about time and the two of them and where they're going in life. And it's gorgeous and so feeling, and it touches something deep in me.
Also sounds like something out of Something Wicked This Way Comes.
I think we've got a theme going here.
Yeah, seriously.
Right. Okay, well, I think you've already answered this a few times, but I'm going to ask it again. Name a book you've read more than once.
Frankenstein.
Aha! Wow.
This is actually maybe the book I've read the most times, which isn't that many, but it's a book that I have read at multiple points in my life, and it never loses its fascination for me.
Got a question for you, sir. Just read it myself for the first time. Listen to the audiobook. I count that as reading. True or false? The monster is not actually, necessarily at least, a revivified corpse or a collection of corpses sewn together.
Ooh. Could be. Although, even though the book doesn't talk about that to the extent that the movies always do, I seem to remember lots of talk about, the size of the body parts being important to bring it back. What prompts
I
the
just
question?
remember a specific thing when he was first creating the monster, suggesting to me that he was creating something out of nothing.
Let's talk about Creature. Let's
Well, he's called the monster in the book, isn't he?
No, I think he's always referred to as the Creature.
My mistake. Well, the Creature, he said something early on that made me think, is he in fact just creating something out of nothing, or out of chemicals or something? And so then after that, I was listening very carefully through the whole thing to see if there was any indication, for example, when he makes the bride, that there is in fact some grave digging going on. Which of course, grave digging is a natural thing for that time period. But and I didn't hear anything, and I was thinking, did they just come up with that for the movie? And I don't know.
It's entirely possible. The whole business of how the creatures, I'm doing it too, how the creatures brought to life and how that happens with the quote-unquote bride, she keeps pretty vague. Mm-hmm. Shelley is much more interested in, what the creature experiences and the rejection it experiences once it is alive.
Yes.
And its sense of isolation and rejection. I mean, it quotes Dante, for God's sake.
Isn't it funny how some of these classics get sort of remolded over time? It's like you've got this creature, right, with bolts in his neck and a square head.
Yeah.
It could not be further from how it's sort of described and portrayed in the book. It's so interesting, and the gist of these things becomes so ingrained in our culture. I remember reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and thinking, wait, you don't know they're the same person? It's like, what? And always feeling like it was sort of anticlimactic because we all know that already, right?
Yeah.
But the people who read that for the first time didn't know that.
Yeah.
That was a big twist.
Yeah.
That was an M. Night Shyamalan kind of a moment, I think, for those people.
Oh, this is going to work out great for Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, their families don't like it, but...
Right.
Exactly.
What?
Exactly. Sure. Okay. Now we have finally gotten to the granddaddy of all questions, the most controversial of the lightning round questions. Do you have any poetry committed to memory?
Well, Shakespeare is generally considered poetry. So that is where I have probably more than most because I have been studying Shakespeare almost as long as maybe as long as any other writer that I can say I've studied. And it's really funny. Now I'm just remembering that in 5th grade, we were all required to learn like 75 lines of poetry or 100 lines committed to memory. And I believe Shakespeare's soliloquy, To Be or Not to Be, was what I did in 5th grade. I have no idea. I don't think I knew of any Shakespeare plays before that except by cultural reference.
Bugs Bunny cartoons. So do you know the To Be or Not to Be speech?
I still know the To Be or Not to Be
we
speech.
must hear that.
Most of it. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing in them, to die, to sleep, to sleep. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come must give us pause. I skipped a line.
Perchance to dream.
But yeah, perchance to dream. But that's
Beautiful.
as far as I can get right now.
That is
I love it.
marvelous.
I love it.
Marvelous. Love it.
Robert, this has been a joy.
Thank you.
Thank
it's been
you.
a joy for me too.
Yes, we must have you back. I feel like I had a question I wanted to ask you about Bradbury, and I cannot remember what it was.
So much more to talk about.
Yeah.
There's, we could just talk about for so long his other weird life experiences, like in his 20s being invited by John Huston, who was making a film of Moby Dick, to Huston's Irish estate to write the screenplay. And what a bizarre experience that was. And he wrote a book about it. But it's also been discussed by many people. It's called Green Water White Whale.
Huh.
Wow.
And it's funny and bizarre, and John Huston comes off as bizarre and megalomaniacal as you can expect.
I do remember what I was going to... It was not a question, though. I just wanted to get your reaction. I don't know if you've heard this, but I came across something shortly before Bradbury died a few years ago. Something that he said that absolutely blew my mind. And I was asking myself, is he serious? He said, Fahrenheit 451 is not a book about censorship in any way. It is only a book about how people don't read the way they used to and how they really ought to read more.
I do know that in his later years, he became one of those people who sometimes says things that seem a little, do you really want to get by saying that? And, it's hard to know if that's something he truly believed. He may have believed it in that moment, but whether he would have said it 20 or 30 or, however many years it was before he wrote that book, I don't know. I'm not going to put any stock in that except, Well,
it is an interesting conversation, I think, maybe for another time, that the idea that our artists qualified to tell us what their work is about. Are they always qualified, I think that's debatable.
I think it's worth sticking away from that, staying away from that.
That particular line, or that?
No,
No, I think any artist who is that, or author who is that eager to tell you what their work means, definitely should keep their pie hole shut.
Okay.
Although in this case, I mean, theoretically, let's say that he really always meant the book to be about how people should read more or something like that, or don't read anymore. You can imagine why he would want to say, this is what the book meant, because his entire life, everyone around him has been talking about how the book is about censorship. But you can imagine that's a kind of a scary scenario in a way, too. Is you imagine who wrote a book, and everyone is going around talking about what a great book it was, but they have no idea what it was about, at least from your point of view, and they're completely wrong, and you're going around telling people, and they're like laughing. They're like, you're crazy. That's not what your book is about at all.
I'm sorry. To me, that sounds like Stephen King saying, I only wrote it to tell people that clowns are scary and they should be abolished.
Sure. Right.
Yeah. It's very odd. All right. Thank you, Robert Ferris.
Thank you so much, LB.
Brilliant time having you here.
Yes,
Thank you,
fantastic.
Lance.
Thank you for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Go to our website, pov-publishing.com. Read our books. Listen to our other podcasts. Read. Talk.
Read Something Wicked This Way Comes and other works by Ray Bradbury.
Read like Ray Bradbury wants you to read.
Read the Austin Chronicle and the art
Alive
section.
and well. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.